Welcome to Voices of the Industry, a podcast by the AI Localization Think Tank, which aims to bring diverse voices from our industry to engage in the conversation about how AI is impacting what we do. Today, we are so lucky to have Alexandra Ralph with us, who is an AI policy and governance expert and the founder and director of Policy and Public Affairs at the Center for Creative Policy and Innovation. Alexandra, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much. I must admit that it is such a treat for me and for, I think, our audience to have someone like Alexandra here in the podcast because in our industry, we don't always have the opportunity to talk to someone with such deep knowledge on AI policy and governance. So thank you so much for your time today, Alexandra. And also, it's funny that you're also a founder of a think tank. So from think tank founder to think tank founder, we'll have this very engaging conversation.
It's the important world of knowledge sharing.
Exactly. We're on a mission.
Exactly.
So thank you so much for that. And just to get started, I really just wanted you to introduce yourself and the work that you've been doing around AI policy and governance, because it will be very interesting for our audience to know.
Absolutely. So I guess I could say that my journey to AI policy and governance has been, I guess, slightly unexpected. I did graduate my master's from entertainment law, and I knew from that point on that I didn't want to do law per se. I didn't want to do contracts 24/7 and just looking at agreements. And then in my previous companies, I had the opportunity to actually start delving into the world of policy and AI, and starting to kind of accumulate an understanding of this kind of really a potentially life-changing emerging technology piece of innovation, and with it came a strand of just very fundamental questions, which firstly was there's no sets of regulations for that. When we started, there was no guidelines and there was no policies. So we were kind of at the very forefront of trying to understand and break those barriers down to kind of translate kind of complex ideas into more actionable steps and items for companies. And as I delved further, I really realized that there is especially for the creative industry, where we're talking about the epicenter of the issue, which is, data scraping, copyright issues, creators' rights, and innovation, and the freedom to advance the technology and potentially help it lead us further to places where we need to and want to be. And I started my own think tank, which is the now called the Center for Creative Policy and Innovation. And through there, its sole purpose is to kind of endeavor into policy and regulatory issues pertaining to creative industry, and now most broadly AI, and looking at what the industry needs to understand when navigating these complex frameworks and new decisions on courts and policy shifts from the government, and what the geopolitical situation is at hand and how it impacts directly the way we work in the creative industry.
Yeah, oh my goodness, that's super interesting, Alexandra, and so much needed. I mean, I think this is one of the most confusing, obscure topics probably for people who are not in depth in working as you are, to really understand the emerging regulations, the emerging precedents, as you said, that are set in court, and really, and especially related with creative industries like localization, where copyrights, IP, and everything is at stake. So such an important role that you're doing with your Center for Creative Policy and Innovation. And just for us dummies who don't know much about these topics, could you start by defining what AI governance means at all? What does that mean for a company?
Yes, I would say it's really interesting because we kind of as professionals throw these quite holistic words like AI policy and governance, but then there's a lot of people who don't really know or understand what it actually inhibits. So I would kind of start defining AI governance. That is a procedure and an effort to put together frameworks, norms, and standards, as well as oversight mechanisms that help the organization and the people guide how AI is designed and trained, how it's integrated into workflows and systems, how it's used and monitored in the real world applications. And at the center of that is, I would call, kind of the core elements, which is accountability, transparency, fairness and equity, privacy and data protection, and safety and reliability. So I would say those kinds of those words kind of form the core elements of AI governance within any company. And I would say in kind of the localization context, AI tools like the MT and LLMs and voice cloning respect, are made to respect cultural and linguistic boundaries and how outputs are ethically sourced or linguistically accurate and commercially safe to use for audiences. So there's always a nuanced context for each kind of company and each industry and sector what exactly AI governance is set to do. But at the forefront and at the core of it, it's to essentially apply the technology safely and maintaining transparency and accountability throughout deploying these kinds of tools and making sure that it's commercially safe for us to deploy for the mass audiences.
Wow, thank you so much for that summary. And when you explaining, it sounds kind of something simple or easy to understand. Okay, we want to implement these technologies in a safe way for our audiences, consumers, and so on and so forth. But when you jump into the implementation side of this, I guess it's super complicated to really yeah bring this to reality, these concepts as and the core concepts that you mentioned: data privacy, safety, fairness, and so on and so forth. And that is related to my next question that I have to you for you in your experience working in different companies and consulting different companies. What do you think are the main concerns for enterprises right now when it comes to implementing AI? Okay, they might have this in mind, and maybe even many companies don't even have this AI governance framework. So I guess it depends on the level of maturity, but at the same time, they are finding blockers in implementing technology or figuring out how to go about it. So, in your experience, what are these main concerns and how can we go about them?
Yes, on AI governance, I think it's fundamental before any company starts deploying tools such as AI, any AI, whether that be open source models or closed source models, because AI in itself does carry a set of risks, and we will never be able to completely mitigate those risks to be at 0%. But what we can do is all about risk mitigation. So it's kind of setting those ethical and moral boundaries in the first place into your company, which is how do we use this ethically, safely, make sure that it maintains transparency and accountability throughout our kind of ways of working, and how it combines and conforms into the values of any specific company. So I would say that it's always a fundamental to rather than just always just jumping knee deep into the world of AI and just start deploying these tools, is to actually kind of take that take that initial step back and just take a look at, okay, this is what we're playing with. Um, there are sets of rules and regulations both in the government level and the national institutional level, as well as just the industry standards. How do we start engaging with this technology? So I think it's fundamental to make sure that you don't hinder innovation, but that you do it in a set and in a controlled condition where it's safe to use and it can be used wisely. So there's as much as there's a lot of principles, I think it's important to start kind of looking at the core points of what are the risks, what are the sets of potential data security risks, what are issues with data governance or server jurisdictions and stuff like that. I think it's really important to kind of look after yourself and before kind of getting too deep into things, and then start kind of working backwards from. So it's kind of setting that initial framework, governance framework in place to make sure that you kind of understand your role and um, your kind of mandates to account for a safe and ethical use of AI.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think every company should be thinking about it, and sometimes in our industry we see, I mean, machine translation has been applied in our industry for many years now. It's not like the new AI wave with LLMs and all that. And I'm not sure how much of this that we are discussing was taken into account when devising those strategies. And I think it's very important to really think about AI from a holistic perspective and how it impacts. Um, the whole ecosystem of a company. So that's really interesting. And talking about something maybe more specific still in this question, I think something that companies sometimes struggle when they are analyzing different tools and so on and so forth, especially, for example, when it comes to AI dubbing. I know you have some previous experience on this, but there's very complex because that is attached to the voices of real people and related to IP copyright and so on and so forth. And sometimes there is a lack of transparency in the terms of and conditions or master service agreements and so on and so forth of some of these tech providers. So do you have like three tips, like these are the things that you need to look for in a terms and conditions to make sure, or these are some follow-up questions that you should ask a technology vendor when you start engaging with them? Any something very practical, maybe in your experience?
Yes, yeah, I do have a few points, and I think it's an interesting field, looking at kind of master level services agreements or service level agreements, um, and those compared especially to things that are off the shelf licenses, and especially when you're kind of engaging on an enterprise level, gets a lot more complicated. I've seen companies, especially when this new kind of AI wave started taking over, I started noticing a lot more changes to companies' terms and conditions
Hmm.
and different variations of their MSAs, and kind of seeing that constantly being revised as the industry goes along, as there's legal implications for them, and as there's been shifts in policy and regulatory standards. So I would kind of always start looking at the two fundamental points, which is kind of legal and contractual ambiguity. There
Hmm.
can be a lot of ambiguity in certain contracts when you're engaging with vendors. So especially on issues such as data usage rights. So, um, are the inputs that you put in used for any kind of model training? I think it's really important to understand if you're trying to protect your IP as well as the identity of your company, is that to what extent is that AI vendor able to use your data for their model training? So I think that's one of the ones that we always want to look out for. And then looking at IP ownership of AI generated content, that's a huge one currently, and I think
Hmm.
we'll be playing in this field for a long time to come, to understand who owns the IP of AI generated content, and in terms of the kind of geopolitical context, we have very variations and differences in these regulatory frameworks from the US to EU to UK on how we interpret the IP ownership when you generate AI content in those platforms. Another one, which is obviously covering your safety and security, is obviously indemnity and liability.
Hmm.
In any cases where like harmful or biased outputs occur, especially if you're looking at from a linguistic perspective or localization perspective, is obviously you firstly want to make sure that it's safe and accurate, but also we're looking at connotations of cultural biases or certain variations of words that may have some nefarious links to different words or different concepts, historical contexts. So I think it's really important to look at like the indemnity and liability side, making sure that what kinds of kind of securities do you have for yourself when engaging on that level? And then obviously a huge one, which will always be debating, which is the transparency and
Mhm.
explainability. Obviously, most of these, especially open source tools, everybody operates in this black box model that really does, it undermines trust. So it's really important for companies to maintain clear logs, metadata about like how those certain outputs were generated, model documentation, like what data was used for generating, who trained that data, and then having options to trace and audit translations or generated texts in those contexts, on data and data protection and confidentiality. Localization often involves highly sensitive information on
Mhm.
product launches or legal filings or patent information. So, enterprises really and companies need to really evaluate whether um, AI tools store data that you transmit into that system. How does it store the data? Is there cross-border data transfer implications? What are the server jurisdictions? So if your server jurisdiction of where the server is located is somewhere in the Philippines, it might be a lot harder to enforce and back up that kind of data security side, because there's a lot less protections in an area like that. And then obviously, what is the security posture of AI vendors? Are they very lax? Do they kind of see these things more as a hindrance to their advancement on technology? And then obviously the huge bit, obviously for specifically on localization context, which is the bias and cultural sensitivity side, that AI tools may introduce issues such as gender, racial, or cultural
Mhm.
biases in translations or generative content, and especially in the context of vulnerable audiences. It's really important because some people might not be able to discern those kinds of variations that may actually have a larger outcome that might induce potential risks to the company as well as the public abroad. And obviously, enterprises are concerned about the reputational damage, so undermining, inclusivity goals that they might set for themselves, and potentially alienating local audiences. So aspects like bias and cultural sensitivity in the context of localization is really important. And then obviously operational complexity, I would say, is managing multiple LLM providers, content APIs, and customization pipelines is really quite challenging. And enterprises are after more kind of modular governed frame workflows that allow for the human review version and control, as well as the fallback strategy. So I know it's quite a long list of things. I would say on a top line level, without going too much into the specific regulatory details, I would say those are kind of the fundamental ones that I think everybody, regardless of how much legal knowledge you have, they've seen it on the news, they've read it on the news, um, and I think that's at the forefront of everybody's mind on what should I look out for. And I think it's really important to look out for those points. It's just what is the what guarantees does the AI company give you, and what guarantees or what rights are you signing away to the AI companies? Because I think it's more than just a transactional relationship where they provide you a SaaS, and you provide the money for that platform API access. Whereas in the AI companies almost kind of see it as a trade-off. You pay them and you potentially sign away data and your rights to on training, and their kind of legal gray area that they want to operate in. So
Mhm.
those are specific points I would say look out for.
Oh my God, I love that this long is very this list is very long because it shows the complexity of implementing technology. It's not some people at some enterprises might think that AI is just a magic button that you press and like everything is now translated automatically or dubbed automatically. But there is so much in intricacies and complexity in this. So thank you for listing that very long list, because it's really important for anyone who wants to engage in deploying this type of technology in their workflows to really think this through so that they can future proof whatever they are doing and be safe and protect their brand, as you said.
Exactly. And I would say what instead, like echoing your point, is if you're unclear on terms, or if they're left intentionally vague in those terms and conditions of a MSA or anything, reach out to the vendor. Get
Hmm.
get things written in black and white where they state this is what we give you, this is what we won't give you. Um, and just make sure that you completely understand what rights you're potentially signing away and what rights you're potentially retaining, and what the indemnity and liabilities look like for yourself. So I think it's really important, as you said, to go directly to the vendor, and then if you're unclear, it's always good to seek legal guidance and advice.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much for clarifying that, Alexandra. And I mean, this is more like on the governance space and enterprise space, what we've been discussing, but there is a huge part that impacts all of this that we're discussing from a government level, right? And I think it's the wild, wild west right now when it comes to AI policies and regulations. Probably you know much more about it, but how are these new regulations, policies created by governments impacting decision making, impacting how or shaping how enterprises are integrating these technologies or facing the challenges of the new AI technology? How do regulations impact this decision making process?
It's really interesting because I feel like we're seeing a multi-tiered approach to this, on firstly kind of going from like top down, now that governments are looking at the regulatory side of AI and instituting new AI policies, on an institutional and a national level. That obviously will have a myriad of different impacts on on AI and the AI usage that companies will deploy, how they will deploy, and how the engagement happens between the technology and the workforce. Um, on another level, you also see, especially in the beginning, where we were kind of beginning from scratch, where there was no no regulatory things set in place, where at times, sometimes us as industry professionals were ahead of the government, where they were still kind of scratching their heads. We were already looking at, okay, this is amazing, but how do we make this secure and ethical? So there was, we put place also standards on industry levels as well. Um, I would say one of the hardest things, especially for global companies, is the variation between how regulators across the board are operating in AI. It's so much more than just regulation anymore. So it is an actual race, and countries are trying to race to the finish line and get the competitive edge. So to give a quick top line view, obviously US was a little more kind of or moderate centric approach to AI regulation during the Biden administration. But since Trump has now entered into office, that's now completely transformed into wanting to do away regulations, and also actually potentially regulating bodies like the FCC, to enforce rules on AI companies, and that will indefinitely also change the way companies will interact with AI, because now if you're doing away potential regulatory frameworks, then that kind of frees up a lot more on the industry side as well. Whereas then we're in the UK, we're a lot more watchful at the moment than taking taking action and leading the forefront of the AI regulatory side. So when looking at other aspects like the EU AI Act that classifies AI systems by risk, so potentially high risk applications and tools for medical services and legal. Um, uh, and then you're looking at the UK approach, which is a lot more centered around what is the US doing and what is the European Union doing, which are kind of currently the polar opposite directions that they're heading to. Um, so going back to the kind of the question, how kind of the regulations are shaping decision making for us, I think it's at the forefront of companies' minds. But it's especially kind of an interesting question from the sense of AI companies, and that's because AI companies are looking for environments where they can thrive with um, minimal supervision and minimal hindrance to their innovation. And as said, I think the UK is looking for a lot more centric approach where we can combine the aspects of innovation, but in a safe and guided manner. Whereas in the EU, kind of went ahead and started automatically kind of putting not barriers, but a lot more kind of cumbersome looks in terms of what the tools are, what the risks involved are, and the classification of those risks. And the US is now kind of solely concentrated on beating China at its game. So, the kind of the gloves are coming off, and that's having all of this is having direct implications to companies that utilize AI and wanting to utilize technology and AI, because obviously not only does that those governments set standards and potential legislative implications where you have to adhere to those points, but also um, it potentially exposes companies at risk of not adhering to these standards, which may impose fines or even legal implications in terms of prosecution. And I think one of the largest developments in the last day was the Google saying that it will not be able to adhere to all the standards that the European Union has set in its latest reviews. So it's going to be an interesting one where companies, I think, are now trying to base themselves in those areas where in EU there's a lot less competition because AI companies are too hesitant to operate in that area because it's for them too
Mm-hmm.
cumbersome to overcome those potential risks and security issues. Whereas in the US, it's kind of become a flourished ground for them to thrive. So, in a long answer and a short answer, it will have direct implications on the way companies are engaging. And I think that's one of the largest issues is that companies are now struggling to understand if they operate globally, how you're able to vary between standards whilst maintaining kind of a standard way of working within AI. So what are the implications of you utilizing this piece of technology in your UK office versus the European office or in the US office? And I think this will, unless um, the kind of global leaders, especially on the G6 and G7 levels, um, um, unless those countries come together and start putting together a more global framework and a more global understanding of this is how we're going to, regulate across the board. I think it's going to be a lot more difficult for companies to kind of remain to utilize. So it's kind of, I think companies, especially larger corporations, are going to be doing it kind of per area basis. So
Mm-hmm.
certain regulatory issues might not apply in the US that they will apply here across the pond and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's something to look out for is that it's a mess. The constant kind of incoming and outgoing governments will obviously always shift their interests, um, and that will impact the direct way of AI regulation, which will then shift policies to a different direction, which will then have implications yet again on a company that's adhered to the previous standards versus the new standards. So it's an ever evolving door that will kind of keep varying itself as per the governments and political interests.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for such a thorough reply, Alexandra. I think that's a very key point because right now it's very unpredictable what is going to happen. We don't know, like anything can happen at this point with the, as you said, with the races, who will win the AI race and all that. So we don't know how governments are going to behave in the short term, which makes it difficult for companies to also create a very future-proof long-term AI strategy, because maybe you are building something based on ChatGPT and then the EU will ban OpenAI in the next year. I don't know. I'm just saying, right? Or you rely
Yeah,
on certain technologies, but then these technologies, will have some restrictions or will dramatically change how they are operating, right? So in the conversations that I've been having with people from the industry, it's more about creating some sort of flexible pipeline workflow strategy to be able to shift things around and not rely too much on one provider or one specific way of doing things, because we cannot control the future and how things will
exactly.
evolve. So super important to have these things in mind and understand the geopolitical aspects of AI as well. So thank you for bringing that to the table. And the last question, fortunately, coming to the end of the episode, when we talk about government regulations and policies and all this that we've been just discussing, in my non-expert like opinion, the goal of government should be to protect people, right? And to protect citizens from any potential damages or risks. And you started by saying something about how to implement these technologies in a way that we don't hinder innovation, but at the same time we are responsible and ethical. And I wanted to ask you, because some people might say, well, it's impossible to have responsible AI or ethical applications. And I wanted to ask you, do you believe that responsible and ethical AI is possible? And how do we define it, or how do we implement ways to make it responsible and ethical?
It's a really good question, and it's something that it doesn't have a definitive answer. But in my opinion, I would say yes, it is possible to have responsible and ethical AI, but not by default. I think it requires a deliberate and a structured approach um, by not only AI companies, but also the people who utilize AI. Because the context of what AI tools are being applied in every day, I think is also fundamentally important. So it's not only it spans across the whole utilization pipeline from service providers to providing that ethical AI to then users being able to apply it ethically themselves. Um, so I would say that it's the deliberate and structured approach would need to include things like the ethical model design. So, including a diverse amount of voices and languages in training specific data. I think we've all kind of seen how biases, what we call the coded bias, is because everything we train AI on humans. Humans are flawed. Our ways of thinking is biased.
Mhm.
Ergo, what we teach AI will also, if we don't look at it in the proper context, will be biased. So it's really important to firstly take that accountability of the biases. So understanding um, how do we shape the model design to be more ethical, and I think it starts from the the bottom ground up, which is, diversity and the, human in the loop structure, and looking at what kind of data you are training it on, because obviously data can have errors and nuances that are considered bias. And then obviously transparent tooling is one. So, when you're looking at model cards or data sheets for data sets, and, having clear audit trails, I think that's a huge point, which is, making sure that you have that data to audit and being able to audit. I think that's really, really important. And as said, human in the loop. So, human centered workflows. Um, it's fundamental for us to understand that AI um, augments, but not replaces, the human expertise. It's meant there to reinforce us, but not take complete and total control. So, letting AI lead the charge rather than you leading the charge with the AI support, I think is another really important thing. So, relying solely on those tools without any human oversight or fact checking, that can start cause issues. Um,
Mhm.
and then feedback loops, letting users flag and fix harmful or inaccurate outputs, especially in the early stages of AI, when we started seeing these, for instance, AI avatars being deployed quickly by large companies. I think it was Meta's AI avatar, where you could engage with AI. Um, it started spitting out very racist and very offensive language very quickly when you after a few prompts, because you were able to trick the model. So I think it's really important to kind of make sure that we get to flag any potential harmful or um, fix those harmful nuances that may be offensive and inaccurate for users. Um, and then obviously continuing monitoring. So, AI evolves. So the oversight of AI should also evolve. So we need to look at, when we put into policies into place and governance structures, that we're not just reactive, but we're proactive. So do the horizon scanning and look at what's in the horizon. How are you able to make sure that your frameworks are set to respond to issues of tomorrow and not just today? And I guess drawing back on the specific localization industry, I think ethical AI looks, to preserve linguistic nuances and integrity, and supporting under resourced languages and dialects, because there's, I don't even know, but I know it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of languages alone in the continent of Africa. um, and then protecting jobs and dignity of professional linguistics. um, that's another important. And then obviously, as we said, avoiding cultural uh, homogeneous kind of um, lack of diversity
Mhm.
by driving more monolingual or kind of Anglo-centric AI systems. So I think it always boils down to the specific industries as well, in the context of what does the ethics look like, when you're looking at, whether it be language or whether you be looking at law, or if you're looking at medicine, or even insurance. We've seen potential concerns or for instance, insurance companies um, trying to kind of doing pre-screening of potential insurance applicants, and basing those on kind of flawed and potentially biased data sets, looking at, if you have predetermined conditions, race, gender, sex, um, and I think it always depends on the nuances of where you work in, but that's why it's so important not only to have the government regulation, but didn't have those sector specific guidelines that we build together um, with those sector specific regulators like Ofcom and Ofgem. I think it's really important not only for them to regulate from top down, but I think it's also really important that they bring the industry experts in. So actually those specific companies also in to talk about what regulation looks like and what the organizational implications and issues and burdens are going to be. So I think it's really important to kind of collaborate together with the regulators to bring them valuable insight of our everyday workings within a specific industry and what it looks like and what is possible for us to do in the kind of context because it's easy to put policies in place but enforcing those policies
Yeah.
is going to be the everyday hurdle we face and I think it's finding that balance between, as you said, innovation and regulation.
Yeah, oh my goodness. You raised so many interesting and important topics. I think we need to do a follow-up episode or a panel or something to discuss all this more in depth. But I think you mentioned two key points, many things super interesting that you said, but two key points that stuck in my mind is collaboration between all the stakeholders is crucial for AI policy and governance in general, collaboration between regulators, industry people, end users, consumers, and so on and so forth, really have this holistic view in place. And then proactivity versus reactivity, right? Don't wait until something is, a mess or something really bad happens to put guardrails or frameworks in place. Really be proactive and try to support and protect the users out there from potential risks. So thank you so much, Alexandra. I could spend like hours talking to you about this super interesting. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us and for your time.
Absolutely.
And if anyone has any questions about or needs in your company about AI policy or governance, reach out to Alexander. She's amazing and she already shared tons of insights with us. So really appreciate
Thank
that.
you. I'm actually coming out with a new report on what I call Hollywood versus AI. Now that large Hollywood corporations are suing AI companies, I will be putting out content in the context of what it looks like in the core of entertainment industry and AI on lawsuits. So be on the lookout for that. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out. And I can't guarantee that I have all the answers. Nobody ever will have, but it's about relying on your industry peers and making that knowledge change. I think it's really important for all of us to educate each other on specific sections and specific parts of our niche expertise.
Awesome. Thank you, Alexandra. And this report will be published in your website for the Center for Creative Policy and Innovation so that we can share the
Yes,
link in the
yes, you can
comments.
go view it on www.centerforcpi.org, and we'll most likely also be starting to do a video content based on that as well. So kind of summarizing and doing short form videos for LinkedIn, YouTube, and our socials to start kind of engaging more interactively with the content because it can be quite cumbersome to read tens of pages of legal language rather than actually seeing interactive content where it actually explains it more easily for larger audiences.
Awesome. Thank you for making that work as well. We are on a mission together from different industries, but with the same mission of sharing knowledge. So again, appreciate you very much, Alexandra,
Thank
and see
you.
you all around. Take care.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye.